some psychologists are less interested in what goes on in here and more interested in what's going on out there. The question of how our environment influences our behaviour inspired another founder of psychology, John Watson.
A behaviourist approach in psychology contrasts very strongly with the psychodynamic approach in that it's concerned with processes occurring outside of the individual.
The behaviourist approach is based on learning theory. Its principle is that all behaviour can be explained in terms of what you learn during your lifetime.
The assumptions are extremely simple. The assumptions are that people will learn to do things if they are rewarded. They will stop doing things if they are punished.
John Watson was the American psychologist who first coined the term behaviorism and pioneered its use in American universities. His central idea, I guess, is that most behaviour, if not all behaviour, is learned and not innate. And therefore, you could take a child and turn them into anything you wanted. Thief, genius, whatever.
So from a behaviourist perspective, we come into the world like a blank slate. The most important influences in Oliver's life will be environmental. We are what we learn.
So of interest is not what a person is thinking and feeling, but how they're behaving and how their behaviour is controlled or regulated by aspects of the environment.
But how do these learning processes work? What evidence is there that we learn to respond to given stimuli in certain ways? Do you have a real fear of something that makes your flesh crawl? Maybe it's spiders. Or mice? Snakes? Richard and Judy? Well, if you do, then you may have been classically conditioned.
I've got a really stupid fear. I'm really scared of caterpillars.
Like many of the most important discoveries in science, classical conditioning was discovered accidentally. A Russian scientist, Ivan Pavlov, was investigating the digestive system of dogs when he made an unexpected observation.
Pavlov discovered, not surprisingly, that animals will salivate if you present them with food. But he then went on to show that if you present a click or a light at the same time as a food, they will eventually come to salivate just as soon as the light goes on or the click is sounded.
John Watson, who was influenced by Pavlov's work, claimed that much human behaviour is the result of broadly similar processes of classical conditioning. Although only 4 months old, Oliver has already learned a lot.
He knows when his dinner's ready, or when he's ready for his breakfast and his lunch and his dinner. He knows that he has a bottle before he goes to bed, bath bottle and bed.
For Watson, even emotional ties, such as that between mother and child, are produced by essentially the same learning processes as Pavlov's dogs. The child's affection for the mother is classically conditioned as he comes to associate her with pleasant things, such as cuddling, feeding and changing. Watson also showed that fears and phobias could be conditioned in the same way with a notorious experiment on little Albert.
Little Albert was one of Watson's studies and as such is, I suppose, infamous in psychology. Albert was left with Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner by Albert's mother and they presumably were going to look after him. In the process of looking after him, they decided to investigate whether they could teach Albert to fear something that he previously liked. And to do this, they made him frightened of a white rat by showing him the rat and then smacking a metal bar behind his head with a hammer. Not surprisingly, this caused Albert to become quite fearful of the rat, and also, in fact, Dr. Watson, who he became quite aversive to when he saw.
It was perhaps fortunate for other small children in the neighbourhood that Watson left psychology to pursue a successful career in advertising. However, the behaviourist perspective was developed in other directions, most notably by B.F. Skinner, who discovered a different form of conditioning.
Skinner was one of the first, but certainly the most influential of the behaviorists. He introduced his Skinner box, where you have a rat who presses a bar which delivers a food pellet. And what Skinner was able to show was that he could modify the rat's behavior in very predictable and systematic ways.
They would wander around their cage and press the lever accidentally and find food came out. Gradually they would begin to associate the fact that every time they pressed the lever they got a reward, the food, and that would increase their lever pressing. That demonstrates scientifically that rewards result in changing the rat's behaviour in that case.
This learning by trial and error is called operant conditioning and has much wider implications.
The difference between operant and classical conditioning is that in classical conditioning you already have the behaviour. So the dog's already salivated or the baby already had a fear reflex. But in an operant conditioning you can train an animal to do new tricks, jump through a hoop, whatever.
Although much of the evidence is based on animal research, behaviourists argue that the principles of conditioning also apply to human behaviour.
Parents used to make me do good things by giving me money or presents or saying they'd take me out somewhere.
They'll ask me quite a few times and then they'll just keep basically nagging me until I do it, and if I don't they'll say they're disappointed in me.
I think they thought it was important to give me a lot of praise, and you know, if I did something well they'd tell me, or they'd give me a treat or something, just to let me know that I'd done something good.
Schools operate on much the same principles.
When you do good work, they praise you and give you merits and certificates of achievement and things.
I was always very scared that I'd tell my mum and dad about being bad or threatened to ring up home and stuff.
Even at college now, you've got to have good attendance. Yeah. And they'll say, oh, that'll affect your work. And basically it's conditioning you to be like good on time for work in the future, really.
Primary schools employ one really scary teacher just to keep everyone in line. And they just make her look so scary, and you always think she's carrying a whip or something. And that's how they sort it out in primary schools. They employ someone special.
And as we get older, we learn through trial and error what works and what doesn't.
You used to go get your friends to go and tell them that you fancy them and stuff, and that doesn't work.
If you just go up and like straight and talk to them and go, do you want to get off me? They're not really that interested if you just like talk to them about them for a bit. That usually works.
When I go to a club, I think the best way, if you find someone you like, it's all down to eye contact, I think, first, you know, and then progress.
However, the behaviourist perspective is heavily criticised today.
The limitations of the behaviourist approach are in some ways the same as its strengths. First of all, that it is a very simple explanation for behaviour and therefore can't really account for many aspects of our own behaviour.
It's always been rather blinkered. It said the environment is everything. Rewards and punishments will explain all human behaviour, where that is manifestly not the case, that we are complicated organisms. Our cognitive processes are very, very sophisticated. And it's also clear that we're influenced by what's happened in the past. We're influenced by our genetic inheritance.
So, is behaviourism still relevant?
Behaviourism still has a relevance today. In its hardline form, as stated by Skinner or by Pavlov and Watson, then no, I mean, you can't defend it. But it has a number of practical applications that are still used.
I really hate fear, but when I see the advert, and it just makes you feel so thirsty because they've got like you've got this man and he's really sweating and all this stuff, and it just makes me really want to drink it. And same with Coke. I really don't like Coke, but the advert where it's got all the sound effects of the can popping and and it just really makes me thirsty.
The behaviourist ideas, classical conditioning, are applied today in many advertisements that you can think of where, for example, when a manufacturer is selling some new beverage, they might have a group of people clearly attractive and enjoying themselves, and therefore you come to associate the new product with people who are having fun, so that the product that previously had no particularly desirable qualities comes to have desirable qualities in your eyes.
And that happens with quite a few different kind of drinks. And they draw you in through saying, oh, this will happen, come and try it.
The more we're conditioned to associate the pleasant feelings of being wooed and spoiled with a product, the more likely it is we'll buy it. It's hardly surprising then that the founder of behaviorism, John Watson, went on to be so successful in advertising. More generally, learning theory argues that the environment provides us with role models. Real men are hard, desirable women are thin. This association of being thin with being attractive and fit and in control leads to widespread dieting, which can then produce eating disorders and other psychological problems. From a behaviorist point of view, such behaviour is not so much inherited or unconsciously driven as learned. It's a product of our advertising culture. In our contemporary, consumerist, image-conscious world, perhaps we're closer to Pavlov's dogs and Skinner's rats than we like to think. Maybe behaviorism does still have things to say.
I think the advantages of the behaviourist approach are in emphasising that however much advances in biology and in genetics are trying to force us to see ourselves as determined, as our genes will decide the people we are. What the behaviourist approach does is say, hang on, there's a world out there that is going to affect us, and it can affect us in very systematic ways.
In this video, we've looked at just 3 of the major approaches in psychology. They're obviously all very different, but what they share is the idea that our behaviour is caused by something we're not in control of. Our biology, our unconscious, or our environment. But doesn't all this sound rather deterministic?